Hi, I'm Dana. Welcome to Made Every Day. Today we're going to make some really cute diaper covers for your baby or toddler. I'm going to show you two versions. One is a basic cover, and the other has some really cute bias tape trim. So let's get started. I started making these when my first daughter was born because I was tired of seeing her diapers sticking out from underneath her dresses. So what I did was I took an old diaper cover, cut it apart, figured out the steps, and started making new ones. And that's the same stuff I'm going to share with you today. We're going to make two versions. The first one uses the fabric itself to create a casing so we can string elastic through the legs and around the top. And the second one uses my favorite item, as you know, bias tape. And we'll use that to go around the legs and around the top. And beyond that, the creativity is up to you. This little one I made using some knit fabric, and I sewed a little heart on the bum. So let's make one. Here's what you need. A ½ yard of fabric, 1½ yards of 1/4 inch wide elastic, 2½ yards of 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape, and a pattern. Let's start with the basic diaper cover. All you need is fabric and elastic. Now the pattern part is easy. I have a free one on my website, and it ranges from babies up to toddlers. Go to madeeveryday.com, click on diaper cover tutorial, and then download and print it to your computer. Then what I like to do is take an additional piece of paper and trace my exact size I'm using so that I don't have to keep printing over and over. And that's what I've done here for my daughter, size 18 to 24 months, a front and a back. Now let's cut it out. Now you'll notice on my pattern that I have these little tabs. That's to help when we fold the fabric under to create our casing, so you're not fighting with the fabric. You'll also see over here that it says fold. That means you want to cut this on the fold of the fabric so that when you're done, you have two sides. So place this on your fabric on the fold. And the other thing I like is that this does not take very much fabric. Sewing for babies and kids is great that way. Okay, I've got my front and my back. Now I'm just going to cut right around that. If you want, you can always trace your pattern piece to your fabric first and then cut. Or you could use weights to hold it down. I like quick methods, so I just hold my hand and cut. Okay, now we have our pieces. Let's start sewing. The first thing we want to do is prep the leg casing. So place the front and back together with right sides of the fabric together, match them up at the crotch seam, and then we're going to sew right along that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm just using a straight stitch here. Go to your machine, do a little back stitch, sew, stop and pivot, go right down. Okay, turn and pivot. Do a little back stitch, and then a feature I love on my baby lock is this cutting. I push that and it cuts all my threads for me. It's almost like I don't even need scissors anymore. There you go. Now let's iron this out, and we'll iron the leg holes also. Pressing your seams is really important to making your clothing look more professional and less homemade. So always take the time to do that. This is that seam we just sewed. I'm just pressing it out, pulling these little parts over. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna iron and press this entire leg casing right here. Now we're not actually gonna sew it in place in the next step. We'll be sewing it a little bit later, but what this does is makes it a whole lot easier when we get to that part. I love shortcuts that make my life a little bit easier. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm ironing it under about 1/4 inch. And since we're ironing on a curve, and we'll be sewing on a curve, these little tabs that we had is gonna make that lay a little more flat. Okay, now fold it over again, about 1/2 inch. You want this to be wide enough to sew a line and get some elastic through. And when you're done, you can see that the little tabs are gone. It's actually now flush with the side of our diaper cover. Now we have our leg holes folded over, and what you want to do is unfold what we just pressed. I know that sounds kind of weird, but these creases are really going to help us later. Then take your diaper cover with right sides together, and match them up at the two side seams. Just like that. Make sure that these pressed areas are unfolded because we actually want to sew those together. Okay, and then we're just going to sew right down the two sides. I'm using a straight stitch here, and I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just go to your machine, do a little back stitch at the beginning, and sew down that side seam. Pivot and turn at the little tab, do a back stitch, and cut your thread. Now let's sew the other side. We just finished our side seams. I'm pressing those out, and then we're gonna sew the leg holes. I've got my diaper cover turned inside out, and what we wanna do now is fold those creased edges back under. And you are gonna be so glad that we did this step earlier, because you know exactly where to fold it. Then just pin it right in place. Go around and do it all around the leg hole. Now it's really important that we leave an opening in this casing so that we can get the elastic in and out of the leg. So what I like to do is mark that point with double pins so that I remember I need to stop sewing right here. And I also am going to do double pins at my start point so that I leave about a 1 inch opening. And I like to leave my opening at the crotch seam so that it's hidden when we sew it closed at the end. I have both leg holes pinned. Now we want to sew the casings in place. I have my diaper cover turned right side out because I find that that's easier to sew on the underside. What you want to do is start at your start point. Remember that I placed those double pins so I knew where to start. And we're going to sew about as close to the edge of this iron fold as we can. So I don't know, about 1/8 of an inch. Do a little back stitch at the beginning and then sew around. Now if you find that you're kind of losing control because you're going too fast on your foot pedal, you can always adjust your speed control over here to make it a little smoother. And eventually I get back to my other double pins, and that means I should stop. Now let's do the other side. And there you go, we've made it back to our double pins, which means I need to stop sewing. Okay, we've sewn both of our leg casings. And at this point you might be thinking it looks like a giant pair of underwear, but I'm always amazed when I get the elastic through how it starts to cinch up and look like a little baby item. So let's cut our elastic. I have 1/4 inch wide elastic. Grab a tape measure, and for a size 18 to 24 months, I'm gonna cut 13 inches for each leg. These measurements are included on my free pattern on my website. And then we'll cut one for the other leg as well. And then for the waist, I wanna cut 19 inches. So let's go ahead and cut that right now so that it's ready. If you find that this is too tight on your baby's big belly, you can always add another inch or so. Now grab a safety pin. We're gonna use this to help string it through the legs. Attach it to your elastic on the end, just like that. And then start at one of the openings. I'm gonna start stringing it all the way through the leg. Just place it in, and just start pushing it through, shimmying it down, pushing it through some more, shimmying it down. This is similar to when we made our simple skirt, which is a video you'll find here on my channel. And when you get to these side seams, it might be a little tough sometimes to get it through. Just kind of work it around until you can feel it push through. And then your safety pin will come back out the other side. You just want to pull that out so that you have a little bit of a tail. Take off your safety pin. We're going to overlap these ends and sew them in place. Make sure your elastic is not twisted inside. Overlap those two ends, and the more length you can give yourself here, the easier it will be to sew. So place those ends under your machine, and it can feel a little awkward because this elastic is so skinny. Now I'm going to sew the zigzag stitch. So I'm going to select that on my machine. And I'm just going to sew a few stitches back and forth, just to hold the elastic ends together. Easy. And now we can push our elastic back in. And look at that, it's starting to look like a diaper cover. Now what we want to do is sew this little opening closed. Go back to your straight stitch and try not to sew on top of any of the elastic as you do this. Do a little back stitch. And just sew till you get back to the stop point. Okay, one leg is done, let's do the other leg. String your elastic through, sew the ends together, and sew the casing closed. We finished sewing both of our legs. Now all we need to do is to sew the waistband. So let's start by pressing it under the exact same way that we did with our leg holes. Use your iron to press it under about 1/4 of an inch first, all the way around. Now fold it over another 1/2 inch and press that in place. Now we don't need to pin everything, but I am gonna mark a start and a stop point like I did before, so that we make sure we leave a small opening in the back so we can get that elastic in and out. Okay, let's sew this in place. Begin sewing at your start point. We're using a straight stitch, just like we did on the leg holes. And we're gonna sew close to that folded edge again. I love how beautifully this finishes off all the raw fabric edges. Okay, when you get to the stop point, do your little back stitch, cut your threads. Let's grab our elastic and pull it through. Place your safety pin through, go through the opening, and string it all the way through. Diaper covers are really great to give as gifts. Sometimes I like to pair it with a little t-shirt, or if you make a dress for someone, it's always fun to include a diaper cover. And sometimes I like to make it from the same fabric or from contrasting fun fabric. Okay, we made it back to the other side. Pull it out, overlap the two ends, sew them together with a zigzag stitch. Now readjust everything, and final step here, sew the casing closed. And we are done. Look how cute that is. No longer panties, it looks more like a diaper cover. Now let's try it with bias tape. Now the difference with this bias bound diaper cover is that instead of creating those leg casings by folding the fabric under, we are going to use double fold bias tape. And the great thing about this is that you can open it up, stick your fabric right inside, sandwich it around, and then we'll string the elastic through this as our casing. And bias tape is really fun to sew with. You can buy it at most fabric stores, and you can easily make your own. I've got a video right here on my channel that you should check out. Now I'm using the same pattern pieces that I did before, and what I'm using for my fabric is a really fun cloth napkin that I found at a store. I just couldn't say no to those elephants. Okay, place it right on the fold and cut each piece. And you don't really need to be precise with those little tabs this time because we're actually gonna cut those off. I'll show you in a moment. Okay, let's cut out our other piece. Make sure that your print is going the same direction so I don't end up with upside down elephants. Okay, let's cut this one out. We've got our two pieces here. Now the last thing I want to do is to cut a 1/2 inch away from the legs and from the waistband. And the reason I'm doing that is because when we add this bias tape, it is going to add that extra 1/2 inch for us. If you left that on, it would be a 1/2 inch bigger everywhere. So just take your scissors, you can eyeball it, or you could use a little seam gauge or a small ruler. And if you cut off those tabs, that is pretty much a 1/2 inch. Like that. Now let's cut a 1/2 inch from the top. Do the same thing with your other piece. Now we're ready to sew. We're gonna start sewing this the same way we did before, with right sides of the fabric together, sew them together right along the crotch seam. I'm using a straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Go right down. Now we don't need to iron our leg casings under because we're gonna attach our bias tape. So open this up, grab your double fold bias tape. Now this may feel awkward at first, but we're gonna sew the bias tape to the wrong side of the fabric. So grab your bias tape, and this is called double fold bias tape. You can also find single fold, but we really want double fold so that we can sandwich the fabric in between. So unfold your bias tape. As you can see, it has these 4 little areas. Take the right side of your bias tape, and we're gonna match it up to the wrong side of your fabric. And what I wanna do is leave a little tail at the end here, about, I don't know, an inch or 2. Nothing precise. And then match up those raw edges and pin it in place. I'm gonna go all the way down here. And the nice thing about the bias tape already being ironed and creased and all that stuff, it's kind of like when we made our leg hole last time. It's easy to fold over, and we're gonna be able to sew right along that crease. When we get to the end here, we wanna leave another 1.5 inch tail. So cut that off. Go to your machine, and what's great is we're going to sew right along this crease that is already in the bias tape for us. We're using a straight stitch here. Do a little back stitch. And I'm starting at the edge of my diaper cover fabric, not at the edge of the bias tape. Just leave that little tail hanging there. Okay, just sew right down. When you get to the end of your diaper cover fabric, do a little back stitch, And now let's do the other side. Unfold the bias tape, pin the right side of the bias tape to the wrong side of the fabric, leaving a tail, sew it in place. Now we're gonna sew the sides. So take your diaper cover, place right sides together and match it up at the sides. Make sure that this bias tape is not scrunched up inside. And what we're gonna do is sew right down the seam, stopping about 1/8 of an inch from where this bias tape begins. And don't worry about there being a gap there. It's gonna get closed with the bias tape when we fold it under. Okay, let's sew it. And let's do the same thing with the other side. And there we go. Now we wanna finish off our leg holes. So turn your diaper cover right side out as I've done here. Find those 2 little tails that we left on our bias tape. We need to close those together. So unfold them again. And with the creased edges or the right side of the fabric together, match them up. And I know this is gonna feel awkward. I don't have any real tips for that. Now, what we wanna do is we're gonna sew right down so that it is flush with the side seam of the diaper cover. So let's do that. Place it under your machine. Do a little back stitch at the beginning. And then you only wanna sew up to where you can see that the diaper cover fabric starts. Okay, now just trim off this excess fabric right here. Now let's do the other side. Now what we want to do is fold the bias tape back around the leg hole. We've got a really nice finished edge that will look great with our elastic inside. Okay, so let's pin this in place. And just like we did before, we're gonna leave a start and a stop point so that we can leave an opening for the elastic to come in and out. So I'm gonna place it again at the crotch area down here. I'm gonna place double pins. Now keep pinning all the way around, and then we'll sew it in place. Okay, I've got that all pinned. Now it's easiest to sew if I turn this inside out. Then I can sew right on the top side of my bias tape. Begin sewing at the start point. And just like we did before, sew about 1/8 of an inch from that folded edge. And you want to make sure that you're sewing over far enough that you enclose that previous line that we sewed on the wrong side so that you don't see any of that seam coming through. Okay, I'm back to my stop point. Do a little back stitch. Now do the same thing with the other side. I've got my casing sewn. Now all we need to do is string the elastic through, sew the ends together, and sew the casings closed. Now the only difference is that your casing opening is on the outside of your diaper cover rather than underneath. So let's do this for both legs. I'm done with my legs. Now let's sew the waistband in a similar fashion. Unfold your bias tape and place the right side of the bias tape on the wrong side of the fabric. And let's leave a small tail again and just pin it in place. Just keep pinning all the way around. These bias tape diaper covers do take a little bit longer to make, but what I love is this pop of color that the bias tape gives. Now when you get back to the beginning, butt those 2 edges up right next to each other, pin it in place, and then cut another tail. Now let's sew this in place. I'm using a straight stitch, and I'm stitching right along that crease line again. Okay, stop right at the end point here, and then we're gonna sew these 2 tails together. So put those tails together, and we're gonna sew right along here in a line. Just like we did with our leg holes. Okay, cut off the excess. Now flip the whole bias tape over onto the right side so we get that beautiful edge. Pin it in place and leave a 1-inch opening like we did with the leg holes so we can get our elastic in and out. I like to leave my opening at the back of the diaper cover where it's least likely to be seen. So now we can just sew it in place. Sew 1/8 of an inch from the edge of that bias tape. Go all the way around. Now we just need to string the elastic through and sew the casing closed. And there you go, one more really cute diaper cover. This would look adorable with a mint green dress. For more ideas and tutorials, check out my website, madeeveryday.com. And for more information on sewing machines, visit babylock.com, where it's all for the love of sewing. I'll see you next time.